Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. So this morning I'm going to talk a little bit, and we've talked about it a couple of weeks ago, and just prior to Christmas as well, because obviously it was a concern. But I suppose the use of nitrogen obviously is very much in the media in relation to environmental elements of it in particular, I suppose. But obviously, given that there's been a 250 to 300% increase in the price of fertilizer since this time last year, there's obviously major concerns about the timing of the application of fertilizer. And I suppose, looking at the media there in the last few days, there's a lot of question marks about people. Some people have gone already with nitrogen and they're perfectly entitled to do that because obviously regulation allows them. And then there are other people suggesting that this shouldn't be applied at all until way out into the growing season. And I suppose today I'm just going to look at a few bits and pieces of information, going back to a slide that I would have shown you in advance of the of Christmas in relation to response, and just want to clarify a few issues around that, maybe, or a few concerns that we have around that. So I'll just share a few slides with you here. I'm going to talk through it. So spring nitrogen, specifically talking about the chemical nitrogen here more so than the slurry. The slurry, as like the issue, I suppose, is that the slurry the deadline is lifted for the vast majority of the country now, with the exception of the 20-week storage period areas, which will be coming on from next Tuesday, and they will be allowed to spread. We have had slurry available to spread in the south of the country predominantly, I suppose, since the 13th of January. So there is a nice bit of slurry gone out, fantastic conditions for it, and fully justified to apply that. And obviously, when I talk about this, it's maybe seeing a little bit as well, we need to be smart with using that as well, obviously, of course. And I've spoken a couple of weeks ago as well in relation to the buffer zones and how they're very important from the environmental element of that early application of slurry. There's no doubt about it that we will get growth from that application, but obviously we don't want to get that growth at the expense of anything in terms of the environmental side of the house either, okay? So as I said, I showed you this slide before for Christmas. I've modified it slightly in that I've taken out the CAN because the CAN is off the radar altogether in terms of the price associated with it. And from that, and as well, from an environmental point of view, urea is the product, protected urea would be the product of choice at this time of year because of the way urea works. It's negatively charged, so it attaches to the soil structure better than CAN, which is positively charged and doesn't stick to the soil. So it would be more at risk of overland flow or leaching from the soil, whereas nitrogen in the form of urea will bind to the soil, and it's a much safer product to use. So I suppose, why am I showing you this again? I suppose I would have told you that there was a requirement to get a break-even response to fertilizer, and I suppose this should actually say the value of spring grass. But and you'll have any of you that tuned into the webinar with Joe Dunphy and Micheál O'Leary and John Douglas last week will have seen that they were putting a value on spring grass of 17 cents a kilo, given that fertilizer price is where it is for silage replacement cost, as well as cost of concentrates gone to where they're gone to. So the value of grass is actually higher than that. So I suppose you could argue that the return rate will be slightly lower given at that. Like, so you can see that we are talking about somewhere in around 950 to 1,000 euros a ton for fertilizer. And in order to get that break-even response point, we have to be somewhere in between probably 10 to 15 kgs, depending on how well you make your purchases. So I suppose the reason I'm showing this slide here again is we're actually talking about a response here as opposed to a growth rate. So explain the difference, you may say. So when we apply nitrogen, we'll get an increase in growth from applying nitrogen, generally speaking. But it's not all about the growth that we get in the immediate aftermath of that application. It's the actual response to the nitrogen application that we've applied. And that's over a period of time. It doesn't mean that we need growth rates to be at 12 or 15 kgs the day we spread. So at the moment, we're probably looking at anywhere between 5 and 10 kgs of growth coming back, according to some of the most limited amount of data, to be fair, coming back through pasture base at the moment. And I suppose it'll be really next week before we'll see what's the current growth rate really, because a lot of the data going into pasture base currently is first cover of the year situation being done. So you're getting the over winter growth figure really. And that's coming back at around 5 kgs. So over the next month, as we're moving into the month of February, we're going to easily average 10 kgs of growth there per day, probably, and moving up into the 15s and 20s as we move out into March. So given that, we will achieve that 12 to 15 kgs dry matter per hectare response as opposed to growth rate that we need to get from nitrogen. So the point being is that, like, given the price of nitrogen, there is a fear amongst some people to spread the product at all in the early stages of the year, given that people feel it might be a waste. However, we have good reason to suggest that people should be looking to spread in the appropriate conditions, which we'll talk about briefly in a minute, because there is a response from it. And the reason that we can be confident in that is that we've done some experiments here in Moore Park over the last 2 years. And we've looked at different rates. So this is kgs per hectare. It's important to clarify here, as opposed to, so that's 24 units basically, or 48 units over the course of 2 applications. And if we just concentrate on the top section of the table, there's obviously a nice bit of data on that. So we have 2 scenarios created here, and as I said, it's done over 2 years, so it's not there shouldn't be a great year effect in it. And it'll be repeated again, obviously, to get further data behind it. So the nitrogen is applied on the 3rd of February. So we're very close to that date, obviously, and it's maybe considered early by some people, might be considered late by others. But in reality, I suppose we are looking at a situation very more likely that when derogation is agreed at European level in the next couple of months, that chemical fertilizer nitrogen will also come under the 1st of February deadline, basically, similar to what is there for the slurry in the 20-week storage period area, and will be actually delayed the further north you go in those, in line with the storage period areas as well. So there's a slight delay, and that's driven by kind of soil type and temperatures, etc. And I suppose in one sense it's kind of logical, I suppose, that in order to get the response, maybe you need to be going into the growth phase, basically. So I suppose the key thing here is that there's 3 breaks done here. So there was no nitrogen applied to some of the area, 15 kgs per hectare applied and 10 kgs per hectare applied. And then subsequently then on the 16th of March, so just before Patrick's Day, there was another application applied. And in that scenario, all of the 30 kgs that we were, after not using basically in February, was applied in March. And then we gave the balance of the split basically on the 16th of March. So where we'd given 15, we gave a further 15. And where there was 10 put out, there was a further 20 put out. And I suppose the key thing to take from this really, and the answer to a lot of people's question in terms of is it worthwhile applying early nitrogen, is that yes, quite definitely there is. And we can see here that there's a 14 kgs per kg of nitrogen applied response from that 15 kgs. Where I suppose the key thing from this slide that I want people to take is from both here, the 30 and the 60, where we don't apply any nitrogen at all in the month of February. And we feel that we're going to get a better response to that application of nitrogen by delaying that application out into March, or maybe late February, early March or whatever. It isn't actually happening. So when the 30 kgs was applied, you can see that if we average those 2 figures, you're probably somewhere in the region of 15 to 16 kgs of growth. However, you can see that we're getting a 14 kg response here, and then we're getting a 30 kg response to this application here. So overall, a little bit of early nitrogen in the month of February where the ground conditions, etc., are appropriate, followed by further nitrogen in March, is driving a greater level of grass production on the farm. And that's your key objective as farmers, as dairy farmers or as cattle farmers or whatever operation you're running, is that you want grass on the farm because, as you well know, it's the cheapest source of feed you can get on the farm, and you want to try and drive that as much as possible within reason, obviously given the constraints of growth in the springtime. So I suppose the key thing to take from today is that an early application, a relatively low level application of nitrogen. So like, again, this is tying in, I suppose, with what we're talking about in terms of the response rate. Now, we'll be talking about a half bag, and I'll show you the plan in a second. So that half bag is going to give you an adequate response, even though it's slightly higher than the 15 here. And then again, we'll be coming on with slightly more, maybe in due course. Another point that I should make here is that in relation to this study here, there was a continuation of there was a follow-on piece, we'll say, to where my mouse is moving there. Hopefully you can see it on the right-hand side of the table, which was a further cut of defoliation, we'll say, so further information in terms of the carryover effect of the nitrogen here. And I suppose people may be saying, what was there an impact subsequently out into April with this? And there wasn't. We're seeing that early application of nitrogen in February is actually carrying through here, whereas that later application is just it's not giving the return for the same application rate, basically. So the optimum application rate is here, somewhere in the middle. So with the early split and then coming on again subsequently. So just to come on to the actual plan then, there's two questions coming in there. So Brendan Healy's just asking, is there in the two scenarios, was there any slurry applied before chemical nitrogen was applied? So no, Brendan, there was no slurry applied in that. It was a completely closed study in terms of trying to get the response rate to the fertilizer. So it's a valid point at the same time in that the slurry could be used to substitute for the chemical fertilizer in that situation. But I suppose it was just to actually drive the information in relation to chemical fertilizer specifically for this study. So yeah, your point is valid in that if there was chemical or slurry used there, it can do the same thing, but it's not chemical down on top of slurries. So just to be clear, we're not doubling up on nitrogen or getting any bonus from any slurry in the background on any one of the trials, okay? And then there's another question. So some farms have a high average farm cover of 1,000 and above, asking whether is wise to go with nitrogen right now, given the conditions on heavy covers, say 1,500. In reality, I suppose there's probably scope to if you're not going to be grazing some of that ground very soon, it probably does need to get some bit of nitrogen. I suppose the importance of the nitrogen there is in terms of recovery post-grazing. So we are going to get continued growth, as I said, maybe 10 kgs average over the month of February or thereabouts. That'll give you another 280 on top of that cover of potentially bringing you up to 1,500-1,800 kind of scenario. And the lag phase that will be associated with that then could be a little bit longer than you'd like if it going into heavy cover. So I think it's all about, it's very hard to give blanket advice here, obviously. And the other challenge with the higher covers on farms then is finding locations for slurry. So this plan, I'll just go through it, try and make it clear to you, is, I suppose, how we were trying to get the message across in relation to it, the use of chemical fertilizer and slurry during the course of the year, or the course of the spring, sorry. So this is for kind of dry soil, and I suppose in reality, you'll see the second table is for heavy soil, and the only difference really is that we're going with maybe slightly later applications, and obviously as a result of going later, spreading less. But I suppose the point can be made that given the fantastic January that we've actually had so far, some of the heavy soil farms that we deal with have already slurry gone out on their ground because the ground trafficability has been suitable for them. And that is obviously good planning, or good taking advantage of the conditions. And there's no risk associated with that really of any major level. Again, reiterating the importance of adhering to the buffer zones for that situation. So we just focus on this. And this farm area here is talking about the entire farm. So there's slurry going to silage ground, or suggested that it could go to silage ground at this stage as well. So 2,000 gallons to the acre going out in the month of January or February, applying your kind of 16, maybe up to 20 units if you were going slightly heavier, maybe if you're tight on space to spread slurry. Then subsequently, you won't be applying any fertilizer onto that ground during the month of February. You'll be planning to probably graze that maybe the latter half of February if you've gotten slurry, or come into it maybe the latter half of February if you've gotten slurry out in that early on, because you'll have a good window between the application date and the time of grazing. And then you're going to be following on then with nitrogen on that in March, obviously, to kickstart, really push on growth, I suppose, as we move into the start of the second rotation. So 40% of the farm is falling into that category. And then the balance is obviously split between 2 15s and a 30. So the 15% of this area here, we're going to graze that first. It's not going to get any fertilizer. Coming back to Grania's question, I suppose, in relation to these are probably going to be lower covers that we're going to start cows grazing on. And the objective then will be to follow that with nitrogen in the form of slurry on top of that grazed ground after it has been grazed. And again, the March application is kind of similar for most of the scenarios. We're going to be coming in mid-March probably with a blanket application on the area that we're talking here. So 40, 15 is 55 and another 30% here, maybe up to 85% of the ground getting 40 units at that stage. And that's so that's that situation. So then we have another 15% of the farm that's going to be grazed a little bit later, maybe, or a little bit so yeah, it's falling into the situation where we won't be grazing it straight away, but we will be grazing it fairly close to the start of February or in that period. So we'll apply nitrogen to that because we don't want to dirty it from the point of view of slurry, and we also want to start beginning to move growth on. So that's kind of covers of over 500 up to 1,000 definitely. And as we graze it, which we'll be trying to get through area as much as possible in the month of February, and as Grania has alluded to, their high covers on farms will be trying to be kind of pushing us towards grazing more of it as quickly as possible in the month of February in order to get ahead. And then that again, similar to the previous area here, which we're holding off of because of the cover that's on it, we're going to come in on top of this then once it's grazed with a further 2,500 gallons. So you can see there that that's going to give you kind of 46 units of nitrogen applied. The difference in this one here is obviously because we have the nitrogen applied here and we're applying the slurry here, we're now only coming back in with a half bag of urea on top of that in the March application when we come to it, so that you'll see that those level of it's not an exact science in terms of the balance of the nutrients, but there isn't a huge quantity of nitrogen going on to that. If we were to come back in here with 46 units of nitrogen here, we're obviously taking that up to nearly 90 units an acre, and that's before the 1st of April, which is a bit in the heavy side in terms of getting maximum use for it. And then the final area, which is probably something like what you've been talking about there, Grania, in terms of the heavy covers, not going to be able to apply slurry to it no matter what method of application you're using, whether you're using low emissions or not. 23 units of nitrogen going on to that in the early February period, and then following on with that 40 unit application in March potentially then as well. Now this is probably, there may be scope for to save a few units here as well, but not a lot. So 35 to 40 units is probably going to be the overall kind of figure. And this is probably this is an important plan for people because obviously we're now going to be working with a lower chemical nitrogen allowance as well. So we have to start saving nitrogen from the start of the year. But the important thing to take from the presentation today is that it's while we want to save nitrogen, we still need to spread nitrogen in order to get growth going. So there's a couple of questions in there. So what level of growth was recorded in the zero chemical N applications, as in utilizing nitrogen in the ground? So if we go back to that there isn't a figure here because we're actually looking at the response in that situation, Pauline. But there would have been a certain level of growth there. I actually can't say off the top of my head as to what it was, but basically the response here that we're talking about is over and above the zero response. So we do have plots, we do have squares within plots on the experimental farms here, where we're looking at when there's no nitrogen applied at all, what's the background growing. And Lawrence and Brendan would often say that your lawn can grow 7 to 8 ton of grass with no nitrogen application. So that nitrogen is obviously giving us that further 6, 7, 8, 9 ton, depending on your grazing management on the rest of the farm. And then the ground in the study, index 3, ideal for lime, P and K. So at farm level, we could see a big variation in terms of growth and responses from field to field and farm to farm. An excellent point, Pauline, in relation to that. So yeah, obviously from the point of view of running experimental work here, we have to make sure that the pitch is even in terms of comparing different plots with one another. So yeah, indexes would be 100% correct on those areas in that trial. And lime, of course, would be adequate as well, or it would be, if it's not adequate, it would be brought up to speed if it wasn't adequate going into the trial. So it is a key point in terms of where you're choosing to apply your nitrogen. And you'll see it, there's a document released there yesterday, or launched yesterday by the Minister in conjunction with ourselves in terms of getting best value for fertilizer applied. And it does emphasize that it's important that your overall soil fertility is important in relation to getting a response to that. So there's a final question there then, have there been any financial modelling done on following this plan versus where fertilizer prices are currently at viability of cost? So yeah, look, it still makes sense no matter what if you go through the figures in relation to this, it'll make sense to spread fertilizer, because ultimately grass is going to be cheaper than silage, and grass is going to be cheaper than concentrate. And if you don't spread nitrogen, you don't grow grass, and that has to be replaced by silage or meal. Silage or meal are dearer, even with the cost of fertilizer where it is. So economically, it makes sense to spread where appropriate, and that's the key thing to take from that. And that's a point that Pauline is making there in her question, is where we have good soil fertility, and there's no reason that if you have an issue with lime at the moment, that you can't address that, because ground conditions are better than I have ever experienced, I'd say, in the month of January. So there's no reason that people can't apply lime on a share of ground that needs lime at the moment. Only caveat there would be that you would definitely need to be using protected urea in that scenario, rather than your straight urea if you're going with fertilizer subsequently within a 3-month window there, which you will be obviously. So long and short of it, I suppose, is that this is showing that an early application of nitrogen, and again, I suppose the argument will be made that this is more part that we're doing it on. So yes, the ground is good, but the premise is still the same, no matter where you're farming. There's an argument even that if we were to go further south down towards Clonakilty, obviously, that the soil temperatures are higher there and we could get greater responses in that area. But then there's obviously variability in land. And again, as Pauline has pointed out, there's variability within farms. And that would, like, the prudent thing to do there is to spread some nitrogen on the areas that are appropriate. So trafficability is good, and good soil fertility, a sward that's going to be responsive. So all permanent pasture, as many of you will know, doesn't tend to wake up basically until growth really kicks off. So applying nitrogen onto that is probably going to be a waste. But I would expect that I'm talking to a lot of people that have a lot of ground reseeded on their farms, and are trying, and that in itself is going to get a better response from nitrogen that is applied. So conditions right, so right product. I suppose urea, as I said, from the point of view that it's negatively charged and will bind to the soil. Right rate. We don't want to go too heavy, but we need to put out enough. So the half bag probably from early to mid-February, for depending on your location, and then coming on again with either your slurry, as I showed in that plan, or slurry and a small bit of nitrogen going out into March, and then or more urea in March, then depending on what way your grazing plan is working around. And obviously, if the weather scenario then as well is poor, so our soil temperatures are quite good. Elidy's figures for the coming week are 6 degrees and higher. So you'll see from, if you look at the kind of the detail behind this plan, it's important that soil temperatures are on the rise, so greater than 5.5 and continuing to rise. So all the conditions are there more or less, I suppose, to start growth. And it's key to come back to this, that the response is not the growth rate. The response is the amount of grass that we grow over a period of time, as opposed to the actual growth rate at a given stage. So we don't need to wait until we have 12 to 15 kgs of growth to apply the nitrogen to get this. It's basically saying that if we apply it when there's 8 kgs, there's still some of that available when we're getting growth rates of 20 kgs as we move out into March. And it's creating the response that we require to get the economic response to that application of nitrogen. So that's it for today, folks. I suppose it's just a kind of timely reminder, and I suppose just to emphasize that while the price of nitrogen has gone through the roof, skyrocketed in reality, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't spread it. It's important that it is spread. Again, coming back to the question that Pauline asked there, the point is that it's applied in the right place, on the right type of sward, and that the conditions are right to make use of it. So your P, you're right, your K right, and your lime status right. If, in particular, the lime status, because the lime status will help to resolve the P and K issues if you have P and K issues. So getting lime status correct will generate better overall nitrogen response throughout the course of the year. So the earlier you can correct that, the better. So early nitrogen will grow grass. No need to go out with a lot of it. A little bit will go a long way. So the plan is out there. Talk to your advisors in relation to it. Discuss it in terms of the grazing plan and how you're going to max or mix it in with the grazing plan. But the key thing to take away from today is that early nitrogen is actually going a little goes a long way, I suppose, is a good way of taking it. It's going to mean that there's going to be more grass on the farm in the run into the start of the second rotation. And like many of you will have been in the situation where we've been very tight at the start of the second round, and in a way that's a good thing, because it generally, when we're very tight, when we have very tight marches, we actually get the best milk proteins during the course of the year because we skin the farm. But at the same time, we don't want to be excessively tight in the month of at the start of the second round. So what you'd like to see is, come Patrick's Day, you're going to do a walk, you're going to see what way you're fixed for grass. You might be stretching your grass a little bit more to maybe get a little bit longer. You might be going a little bit quicker because growth might be good at that stage, and we'll be trying to drive on to get the start of the second round a little bit quicker. And that's your ideal scenario. If we find that we are having to stretch, we'd be hoping that we'd be able to stretch with just grass and meal maybe at that stage, as opposed to having to introduce silage into the diet at that point, which has been shown in some research work done here recently to really hit protein percentages, obviously, as well, compared to feeding it maybe in the month of February. But again, coming back to Gráinne's point, a lot of grass out on farms. Temptation may be there not to spread the nitrogen, but I think people need to think through it. Bear in mind that when you take off those covers, the recovery will be slow, potentially slower. So nitrogen is important in terms of aiding that recovery as well. So small bit of nitrogen where ground conditions allow and where weather is appropriate is going to pay dividends in spite of the cost rise associated with it. So that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back again next week. In the meantime, the best of luck to you all, because things are really beginning to kick off down around here anyway. So I imagine that they're beginning to kick off on every farm now. So farm safely and mind yourselves. One question just after coming in. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we wish you well for the week, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.